For decades, Neverland Ranch was sold to the world as the ultimate childhood dream. A Ferris wheel in the backyard. Train tracks winding across thousands of acres. Exotic animals. A private movie theater. And endless freedom for Michael Jackson's children. It looked less like a home and more like a permanent fantasy world. But there was one problem with that picture. The people who supposedly lived that dream never seemed to describe it that way. And now, Michael Jackson's daughter, Paris, is pulling back the curtain on what life at Neverland was actually like. What she remembers is surprisingly different from the story the public has repeated for years. And the strangest part may be who Neverland was really built for. Neverland was never just a house. Michael Jackson purchased the enormous Southern California property in the late 1980s, long before Paris was born, and transformed it into something almost impossible to describe as an ordinary home. The estate covered roughly 2,700 acres. There was a full amusement park, complete with a Ferris wheel and other rides. There was a zoo filled with animals. There was a 50-seat movie theater. There was even a working train with its own station. Jackson named the property after Neverland, the magical place from Peter Pan where children never have to grow up. That name alone helped create the legend. For years, people imagined Paris, her older brother Prince, and her younger brother BG growing up inside a real-life fairy tale. The public picture was simple. These were the luckiest children alive. While other kids had ordinary backyards, the Jackson children supposedly had a carnival. While other families planned occasional trips to the zoo, they supposedly had one outside their front door. The fantasy became so familiar that people stopped questioning whether it was actually true. Photographs and television appearances helped strengthen that image. Neverland became a symbol of celebrity excess, wealth, and childhood wonder. It was the kind of detail that made magazine covers and late-night jokes easy to write. But there was a problem. Almost nobody was asking the children themselves what daily life inside those gates was really like. Paris has now offered a very different answer. During a candid conversation with Alex Cooper, Paris explained that she did not actually spend her entire childhood living at Neverland. Her time there covered only the earliest years of her life. Some reports have placed the family at the ranch from the time she was born in 1998 until around 2005, but Paris has made clear that her personal memories of living there are much more limited than the public might assume. Her family moved around during those years, and Neverland was not the permanent childhood playground that so many people imagined. So what did a normal day look like for a child living at one of the most extraordinary homes on earth? Surprisingly, it sounded almost boring. Paris went to school. She was homeschooled, and her classroom was inside the estate. She woke up, went to lessons, completed her work, followed rules, did chores, and finished homework. That was the routine. There was no constant carnival atmosphere. No waking up every morning and immediately jumping on a ride. No endless afternoons wandering around the zoo simply because she could. Think about how strange that contrast really is. Imagine having a Ferris wheel and a private theater on your property, yet your biggest responsibility that morning is finishing your schoolwork. The public saw Neverland as a place where children escaped ordinary life. Paris remembers something much closer to ordinary childhood, just surrounded by an extraordinarily unusual setting. And that raises a much bigger question. If the Jackson children weren't spending every day enjoying the rides and animals, then who were all those attractions actually there for? This is where Paris's story becomes even more surprising. According to her account, access to the attractions was not an automatic privilege. She and her brothers had to earn it. If they completed their chores, finished their homework, and behaved properly, they might get to enjoy some of what Neverland had to offer on the weekend. Notice that word, might. It wasn't an unlimited pass to a private amusement park. It was a reward for good behavior. Sometimes the children could see the animals. Sometimes they could ride a few attractions. Sometimes they could watch a movie in the estate theater. But these things were treats, not the foundation of everyday life. In other words, the Jackson children had rules just like everyone else. And when they were rewarded, the destination wasn't always Neverland. Paris has described being taken to places like Chuck E. Cheese and Circus after completing her chores. That detail is almost funny when you picture it. A child living on a property with a private zoo and amusement park could still be excited about going to a pizza arcade. That ordinary detail says a lot. Because it makes the childhood behind the gates feel much more recognizable. Paris wasn't describing a life without limits. She was describing a childhood where good behavior could earn you something fun on the weekend, just like millions of other children experienced. But then comes the detail that changes the entire meaning of Neverland. Paris has explained that the attractions weren't primarily created for Michael Jackson's own children. They were there largely for other children. Children who were sick. Children facing serious or terminal illnesses. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds who might never otherwise have had the chance to experience something resembling Disneyland. Michael Jackson reportedly organized visits that allowed these children to come to Neverland, see the animals, enjoy the rides, watch movies, and spend time in an environment designed to give them a break from difficult circumstances. Suddenly, the property looks very different. The same Ferris wheel that the public imagined as a private toy for 3 celebrity children was being used to entertain children who had very little access to experiences like that. The zoo wasn't simply a collection of exotic animals sitting around for the Jackson family. The theater wasn't merely an extravagant personal cinema. Neverland was also being presented as a place where children in need could come and experience something joyful. That doesn't erase the complicated history surrounding Michael Jackson or the ranch. It doesn't settle every controversy. But it does challenge one very specific idea that became deeply rooted in popular culture, that Neverland existed simply so Michael Jackson's own children could live inside a giant playground. Paris's version is much more complicated. Her family lived there, but the estate's attractions were often meant for visitors. In some ways, other children had more direct access to the fantasy than the Jackson children did. And there is an extraordinary example of that from 2003. Entertainment Tonight was invited onto the property for an on-camera tour. Cameras moved through the famous estate and documented the attractions that had become part of Jackson's public image. At the time, the outside world was still fascinated by Neverland. People wanted to see the place where the king of pop had created his own version of childhood paradise. But just months later, everything would change. In late 2003, investigators raided Neverland Ranch as part of a criminal investigation into allegations against Michael Jackson. Jackson was arrested and charged with child molestation, and the ranch suddenly became something very different in the public imagination. The place that had once been presented as a symbol of innocence and wonder was now at the center of one of the biggest celebrity scandals in the world. The investigation dominated headlines. Neverland was searched. Its private spaces were examined. Its history was picked apart. And the entire world began looking at the property through a completely different lens. Then, in 2005, Michael Jackson was acquitted of all criminal charges at trial. But even after that verdict, Neverland was never really the same. Jackson largely stopped living at the property. The estate became quieter. The rides and attractions that had once made it famous were eventually dismantled. The animals were removed. The train was gone. The constant activity disappeared, and Neverland slowly became a symbol of a past that could not be recovered. Then came another transformation. In 2020, the property was sold to an investor for a reported $22 million after previously being listed for much more. The new owner changed the name, and the estate was closed to the public. By then, most of the things that had made Neverland famous were already gone. No Ferris wheel. No zoo. No working train. No carnival atmosphere. Just private land. It's hard to imagine how quickly the meaning of that place changed. At one point, Neverland had its own train station because the property was so large that moving around it was part of the experience. Years later, there was nothing for visitors to ride. The fantasy had physically disappeared. But while Neverland was disappearing, Paris was growing up under a different kind of pressure. She was only 11 years old when Michael Jackson died in June 2009 at the age of 50. A month later, Paris appeared at her father's memorial service in front of a global audience. The moment became one of the most recognizable images of her childhood. And according to Paris, it wasn't something carefully planned. She simply stepped forward. She has explained that she felt someone needed to say something, and neither of her brothers was stepping up. So she did. An 11-year-old girl stood before millions of people and tried to put words around the death of her father. The moment was incredibly emotional, but there is one detail about it that makes the memory even more powerful. Paris has said she still hasn't watched the footage of herself speaking. She remembers the experience as something that seemed to happen very slowly in real time. But she doesn't feel the need to go back and watch it. For the rest of the world, it became a famous piece of television history. For Paris, it was simply a moment when she was a grieving child who felt she had to say something. That difference matters. Millions of people watched the moment once. Paris lived it. And 17 years later, she still hasn't returned to it through the screen. So after everything she experienced as a child, after the fame, the loss, the headlines, and the endless public debate surrounding her father, how does Paris actually remember Michael Jackson? Her answer is surprisingly simple. When Alex Cooper asked her to describe her father, Paris called him funny. She said he was her best friend. That doesn't mean the relationship was uncomplicated. Paris has acknowledged that it took her a long time to reach the place she is in now. Processing a parent is difficult enough under normal circumstances. Processing a parent whose life and legacy have been debated across the entire world is something else entirely. Yet Paris has made her position clear. She and her brothers honor their father in their own way, and she doesn't expect everyone else to understand or agree with how they choose to remember him. Then came perhaps the most revealing question. What does she want people to take away from her father? Her answer was 2 words, love and light. That's it. She didn't try to settle every argument. She didn't attempt to rewrite every headline. She didn't turn the conversation into a point-by-point defense of Michael Jackson. Instead, she spoke from the perspective of a daughter remembering the person she knew. And that distinction is important because Michael Jackson's public legacy is enormous, complicated, and still fiercely debated. But Paris wasn't speaking as a historian or a prosecutor. She was speaking as his daughter. Her story also makes clear that she doesn't want to spend the rest of her life trapped inside the image of the little girl from Neverland. She is building a life of her own. Paris has spoken openly about becoming sober in early 2020, describing it as one of the most important turning points in her adult life. She has also discussed the end of an engagement and what that experience taught her about relationships and self-love.